Institute in the DC office, and I feel really lucky to be out here in the much prettier office this week. We are delighted to have this group here with us today to talk about a really serious topic, but you're all here because you care about the future of these important things, so let's get started. Nicole Carroll is editor-in-chief of USA Today, and she's going to help lead this conversation, and we're always thrilled to have USA Today here with us at the festival, so thank you.
Happy to be here, and thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for being here during your lunchtime. This is a really important topic, and I'm telling you, this time is going to go fast because this panel is fascinating. I've got to spend some time with them, and you should just hear their stories. They're fascinating. So I'll introduce them, and then we'll get started. So down at the far end, we have J.J. McNabb. She's a research fellow at George Washington University's program on extremism. She's an expert on violent political extremism with a special emphasis on sovereign citizens, private paramilitary groups, and related anti-government organizations. JJ got into this work because she was a financial planner, and she saw some of the grifting going on that was funding these activities, and she wanted to know more, and she wanted to know why nobody was stopping it. So I think that's a fascinating way to get into her research on extremism. Next, we have Graham Wood here, who's a staff writer at The Atlantic and a lecturer in political science at Yale University. At The Atlantic since 2006, he's covered foreign affairs, domestic policy, climate change, food, sports, and more. His book is The Way of Strangers: Encounters with the Islamic State. And I read it, and it's fascinating. And one of the stories he tells is he went to Iraq in November of 2004 as working in a cargo company, right? So he's in the cargo company. He's in the dangerous area, and these mortars were coming at him, and he would get under a bunker with a flashlight and read a book. And he became curious about who is trying to kill me. And so that's how he got into this. Is a really good question. Who's doing this? And then Farah Pandith, who's an author and senior fellow with the Future of Diplomacy project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She was a political appointee under 3 presidents, most recently serving as the first ever special representative to Muslim communities in the Obama administration. And that work took you to 80 different countries. I mean, 80 different countries to talk to Muslim communities and get their insight. She recently wrote a book, How We Can Win: How Cutting-Edge Entrepreneurs, Political Visionaries, Enlightened Business Leaders, and Social Media Mavens Can Defeat the Extremist Threat. And I encourage you to look at both of their books, to get their books. It's really, really fascinating reading on a topic that we care about. So let's jump right in. We're going to talk for a bit, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So I first want to understand the scope of the problem. And so I want to start with JJ, because you look at both white nationalists and sovereign citizens. How big of a problem is this? Can you put it into context?
There are large numbers, very large numbers of people who follow these ideologies. And most people know about the white supremacists. They don't know about the anti-government extremists. But if you look at militia people, sovereign citizens, tax protesters, the numbers are huge. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people. But within that, there's only a tiny core that are willing to go violent. And that's that tiny core that I try to keep a laser focus on. Because you can get caught up in the rhetoric and miss the 10 people that are willing to start shooting or bombing. And on the other side, you have the white supremacy. Racism's been there all along. It's just recently, it's reared its head. It's come out of the closet. It's gotten brash. And it's probably tens of thousands. I don't think it's that big compared to anti-government extremism, but it's growing very rapidly, and right now there's no dampening effect on it at all.
So for those who don't know, can you explain what a sovereign citizen is?
A sovereign citizen is someone who, they call themselves a constitutionalist, someone who thinks that they can pick and choose which laws they obey in the United States, which effectively means none of them. And that any cop that arrests them or any judge that puts them on trial is committing treason because they are above all laws. And that's a problem. That's an open field for criminal activities.
And it's a big concern among law enforcement.
It is. They shoot a lot of police officers.
Yeah. So let's move to the other side. Let's talk about the jihadists that the two of you study. Can you talk about the scale of that and the threat that we face there?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. So I think it's kind of a good news, bad news situation. It's funny to think that there's any good news about jihadism, but the good news, I'll start with the bad news. So if we're to look at the numbers of jihadists, people who are traveling to go train, to fight, to attack me and you, in 2001, it was in the hundreds. The number of people who were in Afghanistan fighting on behalf of Osama bin Laden, who had traveled there, was like 200 people. And then we see ISIS. 40,000 people traveled to fight on behalf of ISIS. So numbers in that sense don't look that great. The good news is that ISIS's territory was pretty much extinguished. There is no caliphate anymore that resembles the caliphate that was being claimed before. The other bit of good news is that as Americans, sitting here not just in Aspen, Colorado, but in any part of the United States, the risk that we face is quite a bit less than we'd find in many other parts of the world. So the number of people who traveled from the United States to fight on behalf of ISIS was on the order of like 100. 100 people in this country. Compare that to, say, Belgium. Belgium had about 500 people traveling. There's 11 million people who live in Belgium, and 500 of them went to fight on behalf of ISIS. So we are quite safe. The number of people here the number of identified people who travel is 73, and there's probably, if we even double that number, we're still in the low triple digits. So that's the good news.
So Graham, just again, in the point of education, in your book, you talk about using the term Islamic State versus ISIS. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so I was very pedantically corrected by some ISIS or Islamic State supporters because they said ISIS was this thing that ended. It stopped in mid-2014 when the caliphate was declared. Now it's called the Islamic State. So there have been people who say we should call it ISIS because that's what we called it before, and we don't want to accept their self-definition as a caliphate or as an Islamic State. The word Islamic is in ISIS too, so it's really who you want to satisfy. Do you want to be a stickler in the way that ISIS wants to be a stickler and call it the caliphate, the state, the Islamic State? Or the U.S. military for a long time called it ISIL. Really, what I go by is what one of the ISIS supporters who spoke to me said. They said, we don't really care that much what you call us. As long as you're arguing about this, you're not arguing about anything that's really important, and that sounds great to us.
So far, you've been studying this for more than 20 years. So can you give us your assessment of the threat?
We have been measuring the threat on a very different measuring stick, and it's been the wrong one. I argue very fiercely that unless you diminish the appeal of the ideology of the us versus them, we are going to be in this for a very long time. When, in fact, we look at the demographic of young people that the bad guys are trying to recruit, we are looking at huge numbers globally. We're looking at the fact that there are 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30 across the world. This isn't about a region. This isn't about are we safer in Europe versus Africa versus Southeast Asia versus North America. The young people who are millennials are digital natives. They're connected to each other in ways that we see every day, and we understand that the most important voices for them are their peers. When I look at that and I look at that data, I'm very concerned about the threat. I'm not looking at it like, okay, the so-called Islamic State has been defeated in a physical territory. I'm looking at how appealing is this ideology still. And the numbers are static. And you can see how many people went to the so-called Islamic State and have come back. We have to predict and prepare for what's coming forward, and that is a generation of millennials and Generation Z that have not shown any decrease in their ability to find this appealing.
It's interesting, just to follow up on that, you talk a lot about this generation's search for identity as Muslims and how that contributes. Can you talk about that? I think it's fascinating.
It's the essential piece of this entire thing. My book is about how we win, what the solutions are to do this. And I argue that solutions are available and affordable right now. And I know, because I served in both the Bush and Obama administrations post 9/11, that when we began to look at how to stop that appeal, we were looking at, in the beginning, when 9/11 first happened, why do they hate us? That was the question that was asked. Or what is it about the West that is not making them welcome? Or is their narrative of the West hating Islam the thing we have to look at? And if in fact we can show them how much we love Islam, everything will be great. So that was the formula, and it's a formula that all of you read in the New York Times and the Washington Post and other places. It was much later that we began to say, hey, what's actually going on emotionally with these young people that is actually moving them to a place where they find this appealing? When they have been growing up, post 9/11, Nicole, the thing that they are seeing all day, every day, online and offline, is the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers. And that fierce attention on them, that particular generation, at the time when they're growing up, has made them hyper interested in who they are. How can I be both modern and Muslim? What's the difference between culture and religion? And I want to say just one thing. We all know, every adolescent growing up deals with this question of identity. I mean, this is not unique to Muslims. We all ask these questions. But when you have a dedicated force of people that understands that these kids are going through identity crisis and they provide answers that are peer-friendly, make sense, we have a problem.
And Graham, you talked a little bit about this, and you both made this point, is that sometimes it's the young people with a less religious background that are more susceptible. Can you explain why that would be the case?
Yeah, so if you've got a background in religion, if you've been going to a mosque regularly, and it's just part of your life, and someone comes to you and says, oh, I've got a different way to do this, then you have to replace what you've already known. So many of the people who have gone to ISIS, there was just no pre-existing religious orientation or theology for them to have to kind of wipe from their hard drive and then replace with something else. So ISIS itself, and Al-Qaeda before it, they would even write in their manuals for recruitment, who do you look for? The people you look for first are Muslims who are lapsed, Muslims who are not, who have this sense of identity that Farah speaks of, but who don't have a strong sense of how that actually plays out in their life. And also, you look for people who are from backgrounds that are criminal as well. So you can say to them, look, you've got some things that you have to account for in your life. You've got to atone for these bad decisions that you've made. And guess what? We've got a way to do that. So if you already have a kind of still center in your heart about what your religion calls for you to do, then you're not going to be that interested in this kind of new idea of what that will require. So you see lots of people who are going to ISIS who have backgrounds as addicts, as petty thieves, and they often are portrayed that way in the media, truthfully, but the interpretation is, oh, they're not religious. No, they're super religious. They just got to their religion as a way to replace the error of their ways before.
An interesting story about you is you were actually recruited by ISIS, Islamic State, in your book. So can you talk about what that was like? And they knew you were a journalist, and they didn't care, right? They still were trying to recruit you.
Yeah, so this is one great thing about reporting on ISIS, or really any group that is a proselytizing group, is you don't have to convince them to talk to you. They think their orientation toward the planet Earth is that everyone they meet is someone who they can convince to be part of their group. So you just say, here I am. I'm a journalist. You can be as honest as you should be. You know, as a journalist, I know that if I had said to them, hey, you know, I kind of think you're on the right track, they would have detected instantly that I was lying to them. So you can just go to them and say, I think you're crazy. I think you are totally insane, and I think everything you do should be thwarted. I hope you fail in life, even further than you already have. And they'd say, all right, yeah, it's kind of what we expected you to say, but we've got some things we want to tell you. And then they begin this full-on attempt to recruit you, to get every little insecurity they can find in you, and then ideally turn you over. But if they haven't turned you to their side, at least they'll be able to go to God and say, I tried. It's on him at this point.
JJ, the title of our panel is The Shared Roots of Extremism. Are there any shared characteristics here in the recruiting methods?
Yes, it sounds really familiar to me. I would go to a trial of an extremist, criminal trial for whatever they had been indicted for, and I would have all their supporters line up to be interviewed. They'd sit, on the benches outside the courtroom, and they'd watch me take notes and make sure I spelled their name correctly. Because the idea was I had an audience, they want an audience. If I just wrote down what they said, patiently and correctly, they could get so many new members out of what I write. They have no clue. And it's not really a religious thing in the groups I follow, but it is identity. On the white supremacy side, it's definitely, wouldn't you like to be, wouldn't you like to be told that you are racially superior, historically superior, that you are the master race, that the world revolves around you? That appeals to a lot of young people who feel powerless. On the anti-government extremist side, it's not quite a race issue, it's a honor issue. You are not somebody having a hard time holding a job or losing your home to foreclosure. You are a patriotic hero. And aren't you willing to do something for your country, even if it means bombing a federal building? And that appeals to a lot of former military who are looking for camaraderie and they're looking for mission. It appeals to a lot of people who maybe have felony convictions in their past that are looking for a do-over so that they can stand up tall and feel like heroes. And that's very difficult to counter.
I've had similar kinds of interactions. One of my favorite observed interactions, it wasn't myself being recruited, but was on Twitter. You could watch people being recruited from Raqqa, Syria, they were recruiting their friends back, in this case in Birmingham, England, and you could watch the dialogue unfold, message by message. It was open to the world to see. And one of them said, I'm in Raqqa right now, why don't you come on over? And the guy said, no, I've got things to do. And then so the one in Raqqa said, well, what are you going to do tonight? And the answer from Birmingham was, I'm going to go to that fried chicken place that we used to eat at. And Raqqa said, oh, that sounds nice. I kind of miss it sometimes. But, you know, I bet you did that last week too. I bet you're going to do it next week. I bet your life, as I see it, is going to unfold with a succession of visits to this fried chicken restaurant in Birmingham. And how exciting is that? Do you think you're going to be satisfied with that? No. We can provide something that's so much more dramatic, so much more fulfilling, so much more of a sense that you're part of not just a minor civil war in the Middle East, or a major civil war in the Middle East, but something of cosmic significance. So enjoy your fried chicken, or come on over here.
Wow. Farah, can you talk about the online communities? You talk about how that plays a big role, that people long to be a part of something more than themselves, and sort of not a great lot of analytical thinking online, that when people see a lot of likes on something, even if they don't truly understand it, they may want to be a part of that. Can you talk about that?
There's a bigger thing here, and I want to pivot off of what my colleagues were both just saying. Look, everyone understands that the human brain does not develop until the age of 24. There are a lot of questions that are happening to these young kids about what they do with their time, what they're supposed to do, how they belong, what tribe they want to be part of. The whole online space is around tribes. It is around networks. It's around finding the people that you think are just like you or you want to be like. And so when you understand what's happening with the millennials, and you're understanding obviously how algorithms work, and you're understanding the perfect storm that has happened, you also have to think also about the content that is available. Graham did an excellent job of pointing out a very specific dialogue in moving somebody from a place where they were happy to go to eat fried chicken on a Friday night to thinking, well, maybe it would be more exciting to be over there. But there's also something in terms of content, in terms of the kinds of curated one-to-one interaction that the bad guys use to be able to recruit. And what I see happening here is we consistently look at the fact that it's happening, and we don't understand that we've actually seen that kind of process in your daily life. Why you picked that blouse to wear today, somebody convinced you that that material and that style was something that you wanted to have. That young kid that's buying a pair of jeans or sneakers has been moved in that direction a particular way. We understand the cognitive thing that is happening. We understand that behavioral listening and social listening actually can be deployed to make you buy something to eat or dress. It can also make you believe that you want to be somebody else or join a particular group. And what the bad guys have been able to do, Nicole, is to be able to curate one-on-one a very specific way of connecting to that other person emotionally. Not intellectually necessarily, but emotionally. Belonging and identity is an emotional thing. And that tug and that pull that moves in that direction requires us, those who are not extremists, to think about what we ought to do to disrupt it. And when we think about that, what we should be doing is to figure out who are the deliverers of the message that have the most affinity, the most credibility, and the most authentic voices to the young people who would be in the spaces. And we now know, 20 years after 9/11, that we can actually scale the kind of content that would get in front of these young people, so that they're not only seeing the content from the bad guys, they're seeing the content from the people who are saying to you, even though you might be bored with the fried chicken every Friday night, it's a pretty lovely thing to do to spend time with your family, isn't it?
Right. So let's move on to that space of the solutions. You hold the tech companies to account in your book. You think they have a lot to do with this. Can you talk about that? Then I'd like to hear from Graham and JJ on your thoughts, because it's not just the tech companies. There's a lot of things that can and should be done.
Well, I go broad. I mean, I think in this moment where America is having a very fierce conversation about free speech, people are limited in their understanding of what the technology companies can do. There is a very important series of things I think the tech companies can do around the content that's in their space. We will not win this if all it is takedown. We can't get past it. That is not the solution. That is one of many things that we need to be thinking about. What I say in my book is that it's the private sector, corporations as well as technology companies, that need to use their behavioral data, their experience, their understanding, their swift responses, the way in which they use anthropologists and behavioral scientists to help the NGOs that are the frontline workers who are building the countermeasures to persuade young kids not to find this appealing. We have been so limited in our creativity and in our scale today. There have been one-offs by technology companies to partner with NGOs. There has been no gigantic effort to do what it is that we need to do. We have been lazy on hate, is the argument I make, and it's about time we stop.
Graham?
Yeah, so I think it might be helpful to just give a sense of what it was like a few years ago. Not just that conversation from Birmingham, but as an investigative reporter, I would look to find real voices from ISIS, and it was easy to do. It was just going on Twitter, going on Facebook. You could look for the term for the caliphate in Arabic, and search for all the posts that had come through about that, and then see which ones contained, say, original photographs from Syria. Then you'd have in front of you a whole bunch of actual voices of ISIS, and they would be there when you looked for them a week later. You could even look for, I mentioned Belgium. You could look for the word, the name Abu something something al-Belgiki. Nobody is actually named at birth al-Belgiki, the Belgian. It's a nom de guerre that you take when you fight for ISIS. So if you find people who call themselves that, it's a pretty good chance that the person is trying to hide his identity but saying he's from Belgium and fighting for ISIS. Now, if you looked for any of these things, if you looked for a post that had come from ISIS on Twitter, on Facebook, you would have to find it really, really fast, because in general, if you're posting ISIS content on Twitter or on Facebook, it's gone in a matter of hours, not weeks. So there's a lot of progress that's been made. Here's some reason for worry, though. The most important platform for actually posting ISIS content during some of 2015 and 2016 was a very, very small provider out of Poland. Facebook has tens of thousands of employees. Twitter has thousands. It's not easy for them to be so good at squashing these accounts that have extremist propaganda, but it can be done. This one in Poland, called Just Paste It, has one guy who works half-time out of his basement. How much of that half-time do you think he's going to spend getting rid of terrorist propaganda? It's just not going to happen. So it's a very, very big problem to both take care of big providers, big social media providers, and then the very small ones that can be exploited and become the favorites of these groups.
JJ?
I run into Facebook most of all. Especially in the anti-government extremist movement. These are fairly narcissistic people who like to deliver 1,500-word, speeches in the style of the founding fathers. They're not going to go on Twitter, or they're not going to go elsewhere. My problem with Facebook is I was blocked in 2016. I was permanently banned from the pages, but all the people I was writing about were not. If you write about extremism and extremists complain about you, they will go ahead and block you off their page. So meanwhile, I go on there, and these are wide open accounts. These are pages with 500,000 followers talking about it's time to start killing such and such congresswoman. Explicit threats. Nothing happens. You can complain about them, and you're told, oh, context matters, you're just overreacting. And yet I was blocked. So there's a problem there. Twitter's a little bit more reactive.
Farah definitely wants to jump in here.
And the thing that's so stunning here, and we talked about this in the green room, is we've learned a lot since 9/11 in terms of what can happen. And we're watching the growth of your industry. And instead of deploying strategies that we know that could be used in the online space, we're not seeing that. Facebook has gone from being Facebook to being Hatebook. And we began the Aspen Ideas Festival with a conversation about corporate purpose. And I want to bring that back into this because, and I don't want to only get angry with the technology companies because that's not the only kind of industry that has a role to play in this fierce battle that we're dealing with, this ideological battle. But it is the most obvious at the moment. And what one has to also ask is how leaders lead and what these companies actually stand for. We are not in the space that Graham talked about a few years ago, thankfully, but we are not in the space that we know is possible. If there was a recall for a particular car or a particular product because something was happening, it could happen overnight because we know what to do. Companies know what to do. The question is, where is the incentive? Where is the corporate purpose for making sure that we are not living in a hate-filled society of us versus them?
It's interesting. We're talking about the message and reacting to it, but if we could, just in our remaining couple of minutes before we open up to questions, talk about the origin of this. And I want to bring up a young woman, Graham, in your speech yesterday. She was in the audience, and I took some notes on what she said. She said she feels like we're not talking about the native Muslims in these countries who've had foreign intervention. They feel like ISIS is speaking up for them, that with all this foreign intervention, they're the ones who are looking out for them, and how come we don't talk about that? And that was obviously her. She said she doesn't condone ISIS, of course, by any means, but that she feels like sometimes we don't take responsibility for helping create some of these things. So what's your reaction to that?
So there are different ways you could say this. And she pointed out, I think quite rightly, and even ISIS would agree with her on this, that the American invasion of Iraq, American-led invasion of Iraq, was very important and possibly even necessary for the rise of ISIS. When ISIS describes its own history, it says, oh, there's this great moment where suddenly Iraq was thrown into total chaos, and we knew eventually we were going to be able to benefit from that. So that's true insofar as it describes the rise of ISIS locally. What I think we need to observe too, though, is that ISIS is something that is transnational. The appeal of ISIS includes people from, say, Belgium, from Norway, from the United States. And it's not clear how the rise of ISIS in Oslo is related to the rise to the invasion of Iraq by the United States and its coalition. So I think we have to understand both the kind of narrow political roots of its rise as a terrorist phenomenon in the Levant, but we also have to see that, as she also pointed out, we have to see it also as the rise of an intellectual movement, as an identity movement that is transnational, and that speaks to something that is deeply felt by a lot of people, that there's something lacking in their lives. It might be that they see the banality of a long future of fried chicken dinners. It may be that they feel like their voice is not being heard in whichever polity they live in. But it's not something as narrow as politics. It's not something as narrow as religion. It's a whole range of causes that has apparently motivated the hearts of many people around the world.
Right, and Farah, you've visited people in 80 countries and talked about this. So do you hear that?
Well, one of the things that really shocked me was that no matter where in the world I went, whether it was in Suriname or Surabaya, that Muslims who are millennials were asking questions about who they were. And that goes back to your original question around identity. And that is the starting point. But I would like to just say, this is far larger than ISIS. This is far larger than a particular group. This us versus them ideology and narrative is connected in all kinds of ways. And what I argue, and we didn't talk about it, we can a bit, but I have an entire chapter in the book around the role of Saudi Arabia and why we have to focus on what we are seeing in terms of a plank, in terms of the system underlying extremism. This isn't just about a political thing that we did recently in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Whatever your politics may be as a Muslim, it's about the feeling, the emotional feelings around who you are and this monolithic interpretation of how to be a Muslim. And if you only believe that there's only one way to be a Muslim, then you are an easier recruit for a group that says, our way is the real way, come on board with us. Saudi Arabia has played a really dramatic role over the last 3 to 4 decades in making sure that everybody believes around the world that they speak for Islam, that their way of being Muslim is the right way, and it's actually eroded cultural history and heritage in such a way that these young people who look at themselves as Muslims, even in countries in which they're living as Muslim majorities, that's the big shock. Whether you are in a Muslim majority country or you're living as a minority, you're all dealing with this crisis of identity, but it's a demographic. It is not just the Middle East or Africa.
Farah, since you bring up Saudi Arabia, I think we should also point out, what did they get for this? What was the benefit of their exporting Wahhabism globally? Saudi Arabia is on the ISIS hit list and has been from the beginning of ISIS. They believe that King Salman is an apostate, should be killed as quickly as possible. And what we see with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the regent of Saudi Arabia, plenty to complain about MBS. One of the things that he has definitely done is rein in Wahhabism, and that is a big change.
Yes, I do. I told you it was going to be fascinating, right? But I do want to make sure we get to your questions too. So we'll go ahead and open it up. I think there's 2 microphones, and there's a woman right here in front. If we have a mic, just so we can all hear it.
Thank you. Hello? Oh, here I am. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll project.
There we go.
Here we
We're
are.
on.
Thank you so much for being here, for talking about this really, really important topic. I have 2 questions, so I'm just going to read one. An underlying current that I have observed through your conversation between all of these movements is persecution, or the perception of being persecuted. Some of this is imagined, but some of it is very real. If you could you please talk about the role that extractive global industries have, could you please talk about the role that extractive industry and war might have to do with the rise of this kind of extremism, especially in the Middle East, and how this ties to our greater geopolitical climate?
And I think that's kind of what the young woman we were talking about was getting at. So can you all address that?
Well, I don't want to get into a deep conversation about Saudi Arabia because there's not enough time, but I get your larger question. We may have a difference of opinion about sort of particular tactics and how far MBS has gotten, but I will just say 2 things. One is, if you are the supreme being around the world that speaks for Islam, you are speaking for 1.6 billion people, 1/4 of humanity. That's what they get out of it. They get a seat at the American table. They get a seat around every decision we make having to do with any kind of Muslim anywhere in the world, and that's pretty fierce. That's pretty awesome. They love that. The other thing that they love is that slowly but surely they have disrupted cultural heritage and history. And so you're seeing an erosion of the diversity of Islam around the world, favoring a particular look and a particular way of expression of Islam. And I am not it is not the role of the U.S. government or any government in the world to talk about what a pure Muslim or not pure Muslim is. That I am just simply giving the data that it is extremely shocking to me to see that kind of change. And while MBS may tell you on paper that he has in fact made all these changes, we both know that I could walk into a bookstore in Leicester, UK today and pull off the shelf a textbook made in Saudi Arabia that says all Jews are pigs. So it has not come back. They can say whatever they want to say. I've seen it with my own eyes. I don't buy it. And so that's my piece.
Previous answer, yeah. So let Grandma and JJ to her question about people who feel persecuted and the impact that has on extremism.
Yeah, I'm going to say a few more words about Saudi Arabia. So,
we clearly want to talk about Saudi Arabia.
This is not a Saudi panel, but it's fascinating to see what these changes are, what's been claimed, and then what's happening. So it's true, there are books on the shelves, not just in Leicester, in Saudi Arabia, in the school system of Saudi Arabia that would horrify anyone in this room. They are definitely, though, something that Saudi Arabia proudly put into the world before, and if it's doing it at the same clip now, it's doing it surreptitiously. So it is a change, and I think I would much prefer that they be put out with a Saudi head hung in shame. Better that it not be pushed out at all. Now, the way that Saudi figures into the view of ISIS is fascinating, though, and it has a lot to do with the question that you asked about extractive industries. When Saudi is mentioned in the official publications of ISIS, sometimes what they'll say is, Saudi had it right until about 1920, 1925. And then oil showed up in the 1930s, and Saudi Arabia decided, we're going to taint the practice of Islam as we had it before with an engagement with the world. We were going to partner with the British, with the Americans, and that caused Saudi Arabia to move along the wrong path. So ISIS sort of says, Saudi had it right until oil came along, and what we're going to do is correct for that. Now, on the other part of the question was about the feeling of being persecuted. Yeah, so that's a feeling that can come from many different places. I mean, I think that what we have to consider is not just the person who is actually materially persecuted, as many people are in the Middle East with the lack of good governance there, but also the people who have that feeling, even though they're in Oslo. And I mean, it's pretty difficult to get persecuted in Oslo. You can try, but it's a very nice place. So it's a very deep sense of there is fault in the world, and it hits me, and that can get to you almost anywhere.
JJ.
It's very different in my world. Persecution is absolutely an issue. The white supremacy side, you see a lot of grievances about white privilege and how they don't feel particularly privileged. You know, if everybody tells them, oh, you've got the world, wrapped around you, everything that's done in the world is done for your benefit, and you're one paycheck away from living in your car, you don't feel that. You think, you think that there's almost a conspiracy theory against you. Persecution is almost every person I've ever interviewed has been a factor. The rest of it doesn't really apply to my groups.
Let's get another question. Yes, right here in the middle.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So we've spent a lot of time talking about ISIS. And ISIS for us in the United States is actually an existential threat. It feels like one, to me in particular. The reason I say that is because it's white nationalism that affects me. I know, because I work in Charlottesville, that has become synonymous with white nationalism and the pain that it can bring. I know because I'm the mother of a young black man, MIT grad, living in Cambridge, and every day of my life, I'm concerned that something will happen to him, that he'll become a target because of racism that has existed in this country since its founding. It hasn't just emerged, it's been there. So my question to you, and it's a personal experience for me, is how do we disrupt it? How do we address it? I heard someone say earlier, what are the disruptors? What do we do? What are the factors that we can employ as Americans who love this country, and I'm one of them, to stop it? What do we do?
Great question.
Great question. Very tough question. There is almost no counter voice to hate right now. Almost nothing. It's not coming from government. In fact, the opposite is true. And I think the people that might be very effective in countering the hate message are just waiting. They're waiting until the current administration is gone, because I don't think they can actually undo what's being done, not immediately. I think they're just waiting until saner times arrive. And that's a bad thing because people are getting killed. I am one of very, very, very few people out there that study right-wing extremism. Academics are getting that direction.
But don't you think, I see all the time groups mobilizing to fight hate. So how do you say there's no counter voice?
But the problem is how they're mobilizing to fight hate is often with violence, and that is exactly what the hate groups want. If you listen to the voices in some of the neo-Nazi groups, the message is let them hit us first, because then we have the high ground. When The best case I've ever seen so far, there are two great cases. One was in Florida, where a white supremacist leader was giving a speech. No violence was brought to the table. He was speaking. Hecklers would not let him continue. It was really effective. There was no violence. There was no threats. They just, when he said something stupid, they told him what he was saying was stupid. And he got flustered, and it killed a lot of his believability in the rest of the movement. Another great thing that happened was in Boston. There was a rally, a white supremacist rally, and you had, 100 white supremacists show up and thousands of counter-protesters. No violence. They just shamed them off that field. That was beautifully done. Far more people in this country, condemn these people. They should step up and say, we condemn you. But the minute you bring violence to that table, it's a free-for-all, and they recruit off of that.
Farah, these guys want to jump in. Go ahead.
I have 5 things, okay? The first, I'll rattle them off. 1, Google 2016 Department of Homeland Security Task Force on Countering Violent Extremism. It is a 50-state national plan to stop the us versus them ideology of all kinds. It includes mental health, what we need to do in libraries. It's a full-on report. Number 2, we've got to stop being lazy on hate. It means local communities have to stand up for what they believe in, which means that you need to see very organic and very real kinds of things that happen. Number 3, the NGOs that are fighting hate right now need help. They exist in the United States. There are a lot of them. They don't have the support financially, and they don't have some of the back-end understanding of what they can do and mobilize. Can we help them? Yes, we can. We need to scale. That is what's missing in America right now. Number 4, the Against Violent Extremism Network, which was started in the Bush administration. It is all of the former violent extremists, from the FARC to the IRA to former white nationalists. It's the only network of its kind in the world. We need to take voices of former extremists and put them front and center so that young kids can see what happens when you come back and what the real stories we can tell. You've never heard of this organization. Your taxpayer dollars went towards building it. Why not? And then, the very last thing, mothers have a dramatic role to play. They are the teachers, they're first teachers of children. What can we do to help the moms across America?
I very much agree on the parents. We've had a couple of recent cases of young adults who still live at home who have decided they're going to do a mass shooting at either a synagogue or a mosque in the United States. And it was the parents that turned them in. The parents that called the FBI and said, I'm worried. I think my son's going to actually do this. And it's almost exclusively sons. There are very, very, very few female shooters. And I think if parents have more access to an anti-hate message, they can at least, if not pass that on to their kids, recognize when their kids are going down a really dark path. The other problem is a lot of these kids do this jokingly. There was an arrest last week of a young man who said he was going to go in and shoot up, I think it was a mosque. He was arrested, he was charged for this, and his response was, I was just kidding. I was trying to be edgy to impress the people I know online. Well, how do you deal with that? For every few hundred direct, explicit threats I see online, one of them might be real. And that's a tough thing to do. I don't think ISIS makes phony threats. I don't think they think it's funny to troll FBI and the press in the United States. The people I monitor think it's a hoot, and that's a big problem.
Graham?
Yeah, I just have 2 things to say. One thing is, in the way that your question very artfully formed, there was this suggestion that we're talking too much about ISIS and there's a different threat here. And that is true. It's true in the United States. It's not true in the rest of the world. So we need to look at the way in which the United States is a bit different from terrorism more broadly. The threats here are much more on the side of right-wing extremism. I'm much more worried about that personally as someone who reports mostly on ISIS, but sometimes on right-wing extremism as well. In the rest of the world, even with this massacre in Christchurch, right-wing extremism as a source of terrorist violence is it's just about a rounding error compared to the number of people who have been killed by jihadism. The other thing I wanted to point out, I happen to know the guy who was ridiculed in Florida to such great effect that JJ mentioned. I was his lab partner in middle school. His name is Richard Spencer. I think some of you have heard about him, and I've profiled him for The Atlantic. About the time when I was profiling him and interviewing him at great length, there was a video of him being attacked on the streets of Washington. He was punched in the ear, his eardrum was blown out, And I couldn't agree more with JJ that one of my thoughts along the way was, how dare that person make me sympathize with Richard Spencer? It was terrible what happened to him. I don't want anyone to be beaten in the street. I don't want it to be from my side. I don't want anyone on my side to be excusing that. So I think that the further we can get from violence against these people who can be shut down so much more effectively with ridicule, the better.
Great. I do want to make sure we have one more question, just so we get the audience. So yeah, back there I see, yes, you're pointing, yes. You've got a friend helping you get the question answered. There we go.
Hi, I just have a question about where the line and the boundary is going to be between freedom of speech and the fact that we want this anti-hate actions and verbiage to be controlled. Because who's the big brother? Who's going to be the party that's going to determine, oh, these comments are hateful? And then if you're going to be drowning people out, isn't that just going to lead to more violence because they have no opportunity to talk, to give their point of view? So I feel like we should be able to address these comments intellectually and analytically rather than, saying, oh, let's drown everybody out, and it's only my view that counts.
I think it's a very timely question. What do you guys think?
Can I take this one?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, First Amendment, hate speech is not illegal in this country. When I compile lists, it's on people who have actually done something, not people who have actually said something. And I think you'll find in any of the talks that I've given, I don't actually say it's government that needs to fix this, because if government starts fixing what people can and cannot say, that's a really bad path. You might agree with them now, you might not agree with them 10 years from now. I think nonprofits have a huge role in this. I think the media should have an enormous role in this. I think people right now are just waiting, and that's unfortunate because people are dying in the meanwhile. As far as deplatforming, banning people from large groups, like large places like Twitter and Facebook, and whether that's going to cause someone to be violent, I haven't seen that. I think if they're going to be violent, they're going to be violent. I don't think lacking a Twitter account is going to really change that much. It's kind of like language. If we call them a terrorist, they won't do it. Sure they will.
Could I just remind you that after 9/11, when we had these conversations about hate speech, Osama bin Laden was able to go on to main media and give sermons for hours on end, on YouTube as well, without us taking him down, because we had this very same question about who are we to make a decision on whether or not Osama bin Laden can have a sermon on a YouTube video. We've been spending 20 years having these exact conversations, and it has not produced the kind of policy or the kind of response by Americans that could lead us in a direction of civility. I think every American neighborhood understands what their red lines are around what we permit. There is a rise of anti-Semitism in our country. There are indications of speech changes and patterns in what our leaders are able to talk about, and they're able to do it because communities are okay with it. We have looked the other way. It is not for us to do something. I think the answer here is not just to regulate ourselves out of this, but us as Americans to stand up and ask ourselves, what do we stand for? And what do we want to have happen in our communities? And ma'am, to your question, just one last thing, how we teach American history matters. And we have failed in the way in which we have taught young people and ourselves who we are and where we came from.
Graham.
Building off of what JJ just said, hate speech is illegal, is not illegal in this country. It's illegal in a lot of other countries. If you look at, for example, New Zealand after the Christchurch killings, the manifesto is illegal to possess there. It's illegal to distribute. People go to prison for this. And even I, as a journalist, if I wanted to read it, I would have to apply to the New Zealand government, pay $127, and they would consider whether I could look at it and then write about it. This is the same is true in France, in the UK. It's illegal to look at the things that I need to look at as a journalist and analyze to write the stories that I write. I think that the United States has it right and these other countries have it wrong. Things are taken off YouTube generally not because the US government forces YouTube to take it off, but because YouTube does not want to be a playground for terrorists. So I think that the way that we've approached this, it's not coincidental that the United States, relative to other countries, does not have a problem with jihadism. We have this open conversation, which has done a really good job of shutting these things down. So I hope that we stick to our principles in this matter and have as close to as possible to a sense of absolute freedom of speech, because I think it's served us well so far and will continue to do so if we let it.
Well, I've enjoyed this time to talk about this, and so thank you all very much for being here, and please thank our panelists, JJ McNabb, Farah Pandith, and Graham Wood. Thank you very much.